Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Maggie Johnson. I'm the Climate Adaptation Program Manager with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Thanks for joining our webinar today. This is part of AFWA's Climate Adaptation Webinar series. Today we'll be discussing managing interactions between invasive species and climate change. So we have a great lineup today. And we'll go ahead and get started in just a minute. Okay. So again, my name is Maggie Johnson. I'm with AFWA. We're really excited for our webinar today. We'll be speaking about invasive species and climate change. So first, let me just introduce our guest speakers. We're going to have Bethany Bradley. She's an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And we also have Toni Morelli, who is a research ecologist at USGS. And they both work at the Northeast Risk Management or Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management group, and we'll be speaking today about the work that they're doing, the resources that they have, and just providing some more information for everyone on this very important interaction between invasive species and climate change, especially in how we manage those. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Everyone is going to be muted today. We have quite a large amount of participants. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A box that you have at the bottom of your screen. If you're having other technical issues or whatever, you can use the chat box too, and I will be manning those throughout the webinar. We will wait until the end of the presentation to get to your questions. And the last thing I will note is that the webinar is being recorded. So I will send the recording out to everybody who is registered for this webinar. And then we're also going to have it up on the risk management website as well, once I get that and we download it. But I think those are all the housekeeping notes that I have. Again, if you have issues or questions, please use the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom of your screen. But with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I'm gonna let Bethany and Toni Lynn take it away.
Great, thanks Maggie. We're really happy to for all of you to be here and to have been invited by AFWA today. I got all dressed up for my presentation. It's been a while. Bethany's associated too. I guess I just want to start before we get into it by saying thank you for joining us during this strange and dynamic time in the US. There are times when it feels like doing our day job feels almost inappropriate given the weight of what is happening in the world. I guess I'll just say that so sitting in on this webinar may not be the most important thing that you'll learn or do today, and we can all do better in our personal and professional interactions to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially in our field. Also be reassured that the work you do as natural resource professionals, practitioners, and researchers in making the world a better place is appreciated. And that's kind of why we're here today. So I'm Toni Morelli with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And we want to talk to you about the paradigm that we're working on, which is translational ecology. So if you go to the next slide, we are working in this space that we'll talk about today in terms of translational invasion ecology. And we're going to talk about how this is a framework that we're developing, and it really is based on a problem that you're all very familiar with. So next, I'll use just an example of this from the literature from work by Matzek and colleagues And this paper is actually about invasive species research, but it applies to a lot of other fields. Essentially, she and her colleagues did an overview of the literature and looked at where was research taking place compared to what managers were asking for in terms of topics. And if that match was perfect in this figure, you would see that everything would fall on the 0 line. And as researchers are doing more work than is basically needed by managers, that those bars go to the right, and if less work on topics that managers are asking for, that the bars fall to the left. You can see here that there's certainly not a perfect match between what research is going on and what managers are needing, but we might expect that this first figure is based on basic research. So if you go to the next one, you see their analysis from applied research. And unfortunately, it's about the same. There's still this mismatch between what managers would find useful and what the researchers are focused on. In particular, you see a really big bar of other, which is all the things that researchers are working on that managers aren't really looking for. So next, this mismatch really calls to mind for us that we need a paradigm shift. And we here are proposing this as translational invasion ecology, which is an expansion of the idea of translational ecology that myself and colleagues led by Carrie Enquist came out with a couple years ago. So translational invasion ecology is an approach that embodies an intentional and inclusive process in which researchers, stakeholders, and decision makers collaborate to develop and implement research via joint consideration of the sociological, ecological, economic, and political context of the problems of invasive species. So I just want to pause there and underline the fact that we are going to be talking about process in this webinar. We're so happy to see the excellent participation here. Many of you may have come just to get a list of tools for managing invasive species in the face of climate change. Don't leave, we will share those, we promise. But we really want to bring across the idea that we need a different way of thinking about this problem. So if you go next, you can see sort of the silos that you probably find yourself in, one or the other of these. And often the researchers, either at a university or at USGS, like myself, are finding themselves on the left side here, where we work mostly in journal publications and theory and working with raw data and kind of trying to do maybe predictions and forecasts. On the other side of that are the practitioners, the managers working on the ground at management agencies and NGOs, and really accessing information through web tools, maps, ultimately thinking about conservation planning and needing decision support. Translational ecology as a whole, and TIE specifically, strives to work in that interim to really bring those things together based on, importantly, a concept that builds collaboration and trust in order to develop actionable science and ultimately to improve decision making. And you can see here from the flower that we developed from the translational ecology paradigm, that these ideas are really based on principles of good collaboration, engagement, commitment, communication, processes, as I've mentioned, and thinking about the decision framing context. So hopefully these concepts will end up coming clear in the next 40 minutes as we talk to you about the work we've been doing. Next. To be more specific about this, to really bring it from this kind of conceptual idea into something that's more operationalizable, we recently developed essentially steps for how to do TIE. So you can see at the top, you could identify a problem. This might be specific to a particular species or place in terms of invasive management. Or maybe instead you already have a group of people that you work with, and given your expertise, then you might think about a problem you could take on. And so these are written in a way where there's not really a clear step one to it. So that's iterative, as this kind of whole process is. But once you have developed this problem and stakeholders, and you meet and you discuss your needs and identify solutions, and you can see that you're then kicking out to think about other areas that things could be worked on. So synthesizing existing research for the research on the research side, thinking about implementing strategies on the practitioner side. And ultimately, there are outcomes and outputs. That's a lot of what we think about, right? Like I said, we will offer up some tools that we've been developing, but it's all on this platform of working with managers for the last 4 years. And so we have outcomes of best management practices, outreach materials, peer-reviewed research. But important to remember, you can see this is iterative. So you want to then come back, evaluate the problem and how it's been dealt with, and improve, and either improve around the process on addressing that problem or deal with a new problem. Next. So sort of laid on that foundation of that we have indeed developed over the last 4 years, but very much in that vein, we have our group, the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network, next. And this group was founded in 2016 to address the question, how can we manage biological invasions in light of climate change? And we brought together a number of managers and researchers in a small workshop in 2016. Bethany, myself, and Carrie Brown Lima, who's pictured in this, who's in this picture giving the presentation. The three of us from our different levels of expertise, thinking about me being not knowing much about invasive species at all, thinking about how can we help to address these issues and sort of the disconnect that we'll be talking about throughout this presentation. Next. We've now expanded our leadership team. Here's what our meetings look like. They used to be a little bit more in person, but we seem to manage this fine. And we've now expanded our RISC listserv to nearly 400 people. And as you'll see, we have a lot of products and outputs that we share, and communication and interactions we have with our network that I'll talk about next. The mission statement of RISC is to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change by synthesizing relevant science, communicating the needs of managers to researchers, building stronger scientist-manager communities, and conducting priority research. And importantly, we're talking about not just invasive species, but the interaction with invasive species and climate change, although I think we find that we're hopefully also helping think about how invasive species management and research can be done better as well. Although we're going to be providing some Northeast examples, a lot of our outputs and outcomes are relevant to a wider geography. And in fact, we have been connected with other regions across the United States, in the north central part and kind of Colorado, as well as the Pacific Northwest, and now even the Pacific Islands, thinking about wanting to expand on this idea to kind of create a similar invasive species and climate change network. And there was North Central RISC just was funded, or the beginning of the concept of it was just funded recently, so it's likely to start next year. So it's really exciting to see these ideas and all of our successes and failures kind of built on in other geographies. So now I want to talk about how we go about as RISC, both understanding manager and practitioner needs and then meeting them. And a big kind of formal jumping off point for us was a survey that PhD student Eve Jury led with our leadership team to really understand where natural resource managers were coming from, what were the needs, and where was information gathered from. One of the cool outcomes of this study, I have to let my dog in the room, I'm sorry. Otherwise he'll just bark the whole time. One of the neat outcomes of this study was that we looked at, if you just kind of focus on the gray for a minute, we looked at how managers issues of lack of information as a barrier to managing invasives. And just to look at the gray, immediately pops out that almost everybody said funding and personnel is a problem. That's sort of already we know that, it's not surprising. What we found a little surprising was that if you think about when you consider climate change in terms of managing invasive species, access to information and availability of information in red get more of an issue. They're a larger barrier. Whereas if you're just thinking about an invasive species, it seems more like maybe information isn't as much of an issue. And in fact, you see the dip down in funding and personnel. So that was pretty interesting to us and really led us to feel validated in that more information was needed. And so in order to meet these needs, we have been, for the last maybe year and a half, producing summaries of relevant scientific papers. Essentially, we understand everyone is too busy to read the literature. The dirty secret is most of us as academics and research scientists don't have time to read the literature either. And so what we've been doing is the group of us, the leadership team, have been digesting important relevant journal articles for a management perspective. And you can see one of those here. We share them over email every 2 weeks. It's really not just the abstract of the paper. It's a paper that we think will be useful to our community. And then we take that and we provide a specifically written summary for managers that has explicitly management implications called out for our managers. So this has been something you get on our listserv, you'll get this every 2 weeks. And a bigger process that we've developed, we have, I believe, 7 of these now, are our management challenges. These are one-pagers on key topics. So you can see that we spend a lot of time trying to make them look really nice and eye-catching and easily digestible. They often, even though they're just 2 sides of this one sheet of paper, they often have about 30 references digested on them. We take, often we have about 10 PhDs or students that are working toward their PhDs working on these at once. So there's like dozens and dozens and dozens of hours that go into these 2 pages to try to really give you information that you would need to understand what's happening with aquatic invasives, or why to plant native, what are the benefits you could share with your public, or thinking about how to deal with sleeper species. All this information, including the summaries of those journal articles, is available on our new website, which we'll show at the end, but I also have written here, riscnetwork.org. Another thing we learned from our survey is that managers that are more concerned about climate change are incorporating proactive solutions. We thought that was really interesting. And so how do you go about doing that next? What are some climate smart management options, thinking about proactive solutions? And so through both our survey and a workshop that we ran at the North American Invasive Species Management Association's annual conference last year, we got a bunch of people around a bunch of tables to learn about what are climate smart actions already being taken. And then we wrote that up in a management challenge to share with everyone, to say, here are some ideas that others like you are already instituting that could maybe be used, along with some resources to be shared. One of these is planning ahead in terms of thinking about preventative management. So, for example, what new invasive species are likely to emerge in your management area? What types of native species are better choices for restoration? So there's recommendations here. You can plant species that are native, that are resistant to climate change, like more drought tolerant. You can think of develop watch lists for your area in order to look out for new species coming in. Prioritize treatment of existing invasive species predicted to spread or increase. Monitor non-native for increases in populations, as we call them, sleeper species. And then an example where there's this great tool online that you can go to look at like future plant hardiness zones. Another perspective you can think about in terms of planning ahead is treatment and control. So timing of management will need to change. Efficacy of existing management techniques, especially herbicides, could decrease. So you can think about how individual managers are thinking about these things and dealing with them, timing with shifts in growing season, testing new management techniques, identifying and monitoring for range shifting in invasive species. National Phenology Network has a great visualization tool thinking about looking at the emergence of gypsy moths. There's all these great resources. Some of this we've digested in this management challenge. Also in the survey, we asked what were the sources of information that managers are using, and we found that, and I should say that these managers are from across the country, although we had a lot in the Northeast, we also had a lot in Florida, out west. So all across the country, hundreds of managers giving us these responses. So like in most of the areas that I work as an ecologist, we found that one-on-one conversations with experts and colleagues is a major source of information for people. So short of replicating ourselves, which we try our best, we found it though very interesting to see that meetings and symposia were also really useful. Management documents and technical reports, I've already told you about some of those we're doing. Websites, we just revamped our website and we'll be showing it off next week. But if you focus on meetings and symposia for a second, I want to tell you about work we've done there. So this we found as a really important piece of what RISC does is network building. And over the last 4 years, we've held three major symposia, we call them. They're basically our annual conference. We had the first one in 2016, which was a smaller symposium. And then in 2017 and 18, we had them at UMass. It's about 100 people. And then 2019, we packed a room, standing room only at NASBA, and then we had workshops associated. We also have smaller, more in-depth workshops where we focus on particular topics, and those happen once or twice a year as well. We are hoping for to hold a meeting in winter of 2021, sort of the January, February timeframe, and we will see how that goes. Another question we asked was about research priorities, and here's where I'm going to be handing off to Bethany to talk about the research that she and her students and colleagues are doing. But essentially you can see in terms of high versus high priority in black, we've looked at the priorities that we got in response, and resilient native communities, range shifting, species and hotspots, biocontrol efficacy were considered up at the top. We were really interested in this range shifting species and hotspots priority. It's something that we feel we have the expertise within our group and we're really interested in. And in fact, we found that the survey that Maggie led of AFWA members identified this as their #1 priority as well. So invasive species management and range expansion was considered the highest priority for related to climate-related information needs for your agency, for state agencies. So that was really exciting to have that confluence, and I'll hand off now to Bethany to tell you about the research we're doing in that area.
Thanks, Toni Lynn. So that range shifting question definitely launched us because from a research perspective, we'd already been thinking about range shifting for a while. My background in my lab group does a lot of work on distribution models and thinking about where invasive species are today and where they might go in the future. And so that really kind of like aligned nicely with some of the work that we had been doing. But from a science perspective, this whole, the last 4 years have been really transformative for me because I used to think that like, well, I published a paper and someone could come and use it. And so working with, but that's not actually the case, right? So working with Toni Lynn and with Carrie has been really fantastic for me because it's changed my perspective as a scientist that I can't just publish something and then assume that people are going to come and use it, that is actually management relevant, that we as scientists need to work harder to both communicate and understand what the actual needs are. So thinking about just taking that step back in terms of why we're concerned about range shifting species in a changing climate, So this on the right side of this slide is a map of where Massachusetts, where I come from, has historically been in terms of climate space. That's the blue Massachusetts. Where it is right now in 2020 relative to that historical climate space, and then where it could be by the end of this century, depending on kind of the I guess, best case scenario or the worst case scenario. And I should say the worst case scenario is in fact the trajectory that we're currently on. So we've got climate changing across the world and certainly a concern across the US. And we expect species to be shifting in response to climate change. And so here's a model for water primrose willow, I believe is the common name, so Ludwigia grandiflora, which is a sort of wetland aquatic species that tends to, grow and change, change the light availability in rivers and streams. Big problem in Europe and identified all across Europe as invasive, native to South America. And so on the left here are all of the point locations, at least as of 2016, where this species had been identified, and then a model in red of where that species could exist under current climate conditions, and then expansion by mid-century. So basically by mid-century, this species, which is currently, more in the mid-Atlantic and the Southeast, could be widespread, has the potential to be widespread across the Northeast. And so these range shifting species, right, definitely a big concern, as we saw in those surveys of you, of managers. But we also want to think about this as an opportunity, right? So lots of us have seen this invasion curve where the biggest bang for your buck happens down here, right? If we can prevent that species, if I'm in Massachusetts, this species is currently here. If we can prevent this species from arriving in Massachusetts, treat it or monitor for it before it arrives, then that is our biggest opportunity for success. By the time we're up here and a species is widespread, not a whole lot that we're gonna be able to do about that species. So one of the main things that we've done is look back at some of the models that we've developed. So this is one example for one species, but Jenica Allen, who is a part of the RISC leadership team, had led a paper several years ago that we collaborated on, where she modeled almost 900 invasive plants across the US. And so what I want to show you, I'm going to actually jump out of the PowerPoint for a second to show you some of these tools that are now available on EdMaps. So this is a screen capture for giant read of EdMaps. I think I actually pulled up kudzu rather than the giant read. But here is, in the current EdMaps website for kudzu. Here's its current distribution. So all of the green counties are ones where kudzu is currently present. So Jenica worked with Chuck Bargeron and Joe LaForest down at EdMaps to get these spatial models of future potential for these species into EdMaps, and that's here. So if you click on future certainty, you instead get a map that looks like this. And so what this map is everything from 0 climate models. So one of the things that we do when we're doing distribution modeling is to stack a whole bunch of different climate scenarios on top of each other. So different climate modeling groups come up with different projections of what future climate may be. As we get more and more overlap, so down to 13 is the total number of models that we used in this case, then we have pretty high certainty that species is likely to be suitable climatically in whatever that county is. So everything that you see in dark green on this this map in EdMaps, these are all counties with 13 models, all agreeing that by 2050 that county will be suitable for kudzu invasion. I forget. I'm just going to go back in here briefly. All right, so that's this work led by Jenica Allen, so her picture is there. But that's one species, right? And so we know that range shifts can occur for many species. And one of the key things that, as we were talking to invasive species managers, at least across the Northeast, was this ask of, well, what species are they? Can you give us a list of, what we should expect in Massachusetts or whatever state you were focused on. And so Jenica did that. So with funding from the Northeast IPM Center, she took these models that she had developed in 2016 and generated a state-by-state watch list for which species are likely to become invasive in those states. So this is a second tool. It's the range shift listing tool. You can get there, edmaps.org/range shift listing, and I will show you that one. So here's the website, edmaps.org/range shift listing. And essentially what you can do, so this is built upon those other models that we just saw with kudzu, right? So we have this sort of certainty in terms of everything from 0 to 13 models overlapping. So we can choose a state. Let's choose Minnesota. And then we can choose a number of models. So 13 would be really, really high confidence that that species, all 13 climate models overlap and say that the species on that list will be or could be in Minnesota by 2050. We usually use, 10 or 11, something like that. So, 70 or 80% model overlap. And then we can pick another criteria here, which is, do we want a species that's observed anywhere within the country, just in an adjacent state, within a radius of a certain number of miles, within ecoregions that are found in Minnesota? So I'm just going to pick an adjacent state for these purposes, and that'll update us. So this says, now we get this list of, there are 40 species, 40 plants on this species that are have the potential based on 10 climate models to be in Minnesota by 2050 and are already present in one of the states adjacent to Minnesota. And there's a download button. So if you're interested in that list of species, you can go ahead and download it and see what all of these are. There's the download button with the red box around it, just to remind me to say downloadable for all of these. And this is for all of the lower 48 states. So the climate models that we created, or the species distribution models that we created originally, were based on distributions within the lower 48. So those are the extents of this tool. So we've had this tool for a while, and so when Jenica was initially creating some of the watch lists, one of the things that we said is, well, for the Northeast, can we focus a little, like give us the list first. We'll get the sort of behind the scenes before this goes live on EdMaps, some information about what species are likely to shift into New England. New York and New England are kind of our Northeast focal areas. So here's an example watch list for New York and Southern New England. So basically Southern New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. We put those 4 lists together and found, all of the different species. So there are some that could establish currently and then expand by 2050. And then there are some that could not establish currently, but can by 2050. it turns out there's 100 species on that list, right? So it's a pretty long list. And, you know, as we were talking to managers, you know, basically nobody's seen any of these species for the most part. They're not widespread in New England. And so if I give you a list of 100 species you've never seen before, that's really challenging in terms of, you know, what actually are the priorities for monitoring and ultimately for management. And so we followed this along a little bit further. First, we identify this list of range shifting species. The next question then becomes, how do we prioritize that list? What are the species that we actually want to say, this is a high risk, high priority species that we want to focus on? And so with a team of 3 at this point phenomenal undergraduates or recent UMass grads, May Rockwell Postal, Bridget Griffin, and Will Coville, they have focused on this one risk assessment tool, which is called ICAT, the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa. And this is a fairly time-intensive protocol for assessing risk assessment. It only focuses on impacts, so ecological impacts predominantly, although we have added agricultural, human health, and economic impacts to our assessment. It's time-intensive because it requires going through the entirety of the scientific literature, all titles and abstracts of papers focus on that species to identify any papers that report impacts of some sort. And so what we've done to date for the Northeast is that we've assessed all those 100 range shifting species for Southern New England and New York. That involved scanning about 14,000 titles, identifying what turned out to be 865 papers that reported impacts for one or more of those species. We ended up being able to evaluate 82 of the 100 species, which I should say was actually kind of a pleasant surprise for me. You know, a lot of times in invasion ecology, we think that we know little to nothing about the impacts of invasive plants, but we actually had some information about impacts for 82 out of 100, so that was pretty good. Of those, we used this impact assessment and put 26 in the minor impact category. So those are species where there was some impact reported, but nothing specifically reported in terms of a negative impact on native species or communities. So no loss in the population of native species, no loss of diversity or richness associated with that invasion. We had 36 that showed up as moderate impacts. So those were ones where the paper demonstrated that the invasive species was related to a loss of a single species population, so decline in a single species. And then we had 20 of those 100 species that had a major impact, and those were ones that had decline in multi-species populations or a loss of community diversity. For those 20 major impacts, we had a secondary evaluation. So we looked at our confidence in that impact score. So, you know, does it really look likely that it's the invasive species that's causing that impact, as opposed to, you know, there was a disturbance and we saw a correlation rather than a likely causation. And then we also looked at vulnerability of Northeast ecosystems to those specific species. You know, do they actually invade temperate forests? Are they likely to invade wetlands or grasslands or other communities that are common in the Northeast? I want to pause for just a second there and say, that has been a lot of work. You know, if I went back to the beginning, I'm not totally sure if I would go with this particular protocol for impact assessment. But the big plus of it is that it gives us a consistent method. The ICAT method has been endorsed by the IUCN, so it's sort of this, at least European, if not global, you know, recommendation for how to do impact assessments. The other nice thing about it is that gives you a transparent database, basically, of here are all the papers that we could find anyway, or peer-reviewed published papers, that tell us about impact of that species. And so you can take that information and use it in a weed risk assessment that your state or region might have. As we've kind of gone along, and I'm going to continue to pull the string a little bit further, we've been looking around at other weed risk assessments that different states have, that the USDA has come up with. For example, the plant protection and quarantine protocols. Some of those might be faster and cover a broader range of management concerns. So not just impacts. Impacts are important, but not the only thing. We might also want to consider, does it spread quickly? Can it be managed? Other criteria like that. So with the ICAT assessment, we've identified 5. So we started out with 100. We narrowed it down to 5 major impact species that are likely to affect Northeast ecosystems. So of high risk, those 5 species are burr chervil, giant reed, slender oat, water primrose, which I showed you that map of early on in the beginning, and elm leaf blackberry. So this paper for Southern New York and Southern New England is published now. So it's a publication that's available on our website. And we also created a management challenge. So not quite it's actually 4 pages total, or 2 pages front and back, going through how we did this prioritization and the high impact, high risk species, and a little bit of information about those. So if you're interested in those for Southern New England, that's where you can find them. We are currently working on species for Northern New England and New York. There are 83 species on that list. We are 55 into that list of 83. And so far for the Northern New England states, so Northern New England, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, we've got 20 species so far of those 55, so a bit of a higher rate with major impacts. Those include species that you've probably heard of, like kudzu. They also include pretty widespread ornamental plant species like winter creeper, Neonimus fortunii. And I put below that some information about where those species are regulated, because that has sort of turned into the next question of this process, right? So we can create a watch list, we can prioritize that watch list, but unless we're actually watching for the watch list, we're not being proactive in terms of invasive species range shifts, right? So kudzu, as an example, is currently regulated and it depends on the state what regulated actually means. In some states, regulated means you can't plant it. Not too many people wanting to plant kudzu these days, although, they did back in the day. So you can't plant it in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New York currently. Winter creeper, not regulated in any of the Northeast states, even though it is high impact and already present in some of the Southern New England states. Only regulated in Maryland at this point. So again, going back to that, climate change is an opportunity for proactive management. Here we are at the potential for prevention stage, the potential to be proactive, right? Where we could either list some of these species, so species, for example, that are sold as ornamental plants could be on that list, or we could be focusing on species for management and monitoring, ones that aren't widely sold as ornamentals like kudzu or something, just be watching out for those populations increasing or expanding. And so we wanted to ask the question then, okay, well, let's look at our regulatory lists and ask the question of how proactive are we? So here's the answer to that question for Northeast states, where in this case, what you're looking at is the number of counties where a species is, where this So this is the percent of counties that listed species are present in each state. So for example, in Vermont, on average, 35% of counties contain listed species. So if you're up here, then that means that that list is very reactive. That is, we are listing species that are already present in 100% of the state. So not doing a great job at that sort of prevention because those species are already widespread. If we're down here, then we're much more proactive. So we are listing species, and if you've got a point on the 0 for any of these states, then that means that we've got at least one species listed for regulation that is not yet present anywhere in that state. So much more proactive. So from a climate change perspective, we really want to be down here. In the Northeast, we are obviously at the other end of that spectrum. So that was the Northeast. This is all across the lower 48 states. And the Northeast, we're actually, you see more Northeast states on this end of the spectrum. But as a whole, we tend to be on the reactive side. Like we're pretty good at regulating plants that are already widespread and problematic, right? But we know from invasive species science that the win comes from listing the species down here, right? Listing the ones that are not yet present, not yet widespread within our states. So that is, and I really want to leave you guys with that point because we are not yet thinking this way. This hasn't yet moved into our policies and into our regulation, and it hasn't necessarily moved into our management. And that, I think, if nothing else today, we really want you guys to be thinking about how can we be more proactive in terms of thinking about specifically what's coming next. And one of the things that we can potentially do is develop more networks with a broader range of neighbors. So it turns out that if you look at the regulatory lists of different states, they have about 30% overlap on average with their neighbors, which means that states are not coordinating very well at all in terms of which species they're considering invasive, which ones they're prioritizing to stop planting, stop introducing, or monitor for. And so this is our kind of ongoing project for the Northeast at least, trying to get some more regional discussion started of how can we, across state borders in the Northeast, do a better job of sharing information that we have about existing weed risk assessments so that our lists are more consistent and ideally more proactive. And then one last piece of research that I want to leave you guys with is we've talked a lot about range shifting of invasive species. We also have done some work on range shifting of native species, where from a climate adaptation perspective, supporting range shifts for native species is really important. From an invasive species science perspective, we know that a few of those species can be bad actors. Black locust is a good example of that. So Toni Lynn claimed earlier on that she hasn't done a lot of invasive species research, but she's actually a liar. She's done this fantastic paper that is now published, and we will soon have a management challenge coming out probably next month on these some guides for things that we want to think about in terms of, are there some bad actors in that set of range shifting species? So conclusions from us is that, climate change is definitely creating risks, but I hope you guys will think of this also as opportunities, opportunities to expand our networks further so that we can learn from our neighbors, work together, share knowledge, because we're going to need that across multiple states, multiple jurisdictions, if we're going to succeed at reducing the combined impacts of invasive species and climate change. And then lastly, I will just leave it here, but please join us. If you're interested in this work, join the RISC Network. We have a new website, riscnetwork.org. the front page has information about how to sign up for our listserv and get more information. And with that, I'll hand it back to Maggie for any Q&A.
Thank you, Bethany. Thank you, Toni Lynn. That was an excellent presentation. You have thought so much about this issue and have so many resources and information available. It's great to share that with so many folks today. I guess the first question I'll just throw out is if people want to access all of the resources, the listservs, everything that you shared today, can they find all of that information at riscnetwork.org?
That's our hope, that they can find all the information there. We've tried to put, one of the big things that we've done over the last couple of months is to get all of the research summaries. So those are the, things that we send out every couple of weeks to the listserv, synthesis of single papers. So that's all on our website now too. And yeah, if you guys want to comb through our website and let us know what we're missing, we're happy to go dig it up and make sure it gets there.
Excellent, thank you. And I know I do receive those emails. I'm on the listserv, and it's a great information, and I try to share that with all of my networks as well. So I really suggest everybody go to their website, sign up for the listserv, check out all the resources. So now as we go into the Q&A, feel free to add questions to either the Q&A box or the chat box. And I see one question come up. Oh, before I go to that, I know, Bethany, your volume was going in and out a little bit. I know at least one person was having trouble hearing you. So if others are having trouble as well, we might ask you to call back in.
Sure.
But that aside, I have one question up already. Can/will the RISC organization model expand outside of the Northeast?
Yeah, so I see a question about Canada and maybe the Northeast and outside of the Northeast in general. So yes, we have had interest from colleagues across the Climate Adaptation Science Center network and other colleagues across USGS and academia. And so we are helping to share our lessons learned and successes and mistakes in different regions, and including, as I mentioned, a grant was just awarded by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center to Chelsea Nagy and colleagues at UC Boulder, so they'll be starting something up there. So yeah, it's really exciting. There's expansion. I don't think we've done much with Canada, but I think it makes a lot of sense. So if there's people there that are interested, we're happy. And I see a question from Lynn. Hi, Lynn. It's always nice to hear from you. About if we've done similar analyses for animal invasives. I am an animal person myself, which is why I'm always pleading ignorance. Mostly we focused on plants, partly because that's the expertise of Bethany and some of our other colleagues on the leadership team. A lot, because that's a lot of what state and federal resource managers are working with, are dealing with invasive plants. But there's a lot of interest in thinking about aquatic animal invasives, and we do a lot of work on forest pests as well with our with collaborators with National Phenology Network and others. But I'm happy to hear suggestions of animal invasives that we could tackle.
Great, thanks, Toni Lynn. We have another question asking, how is the RISC network talking about ecological transformation? So the idea that invasives can become the new quote unquote natives.
We're not talking about that yet. So that seems like a really good, so a lot of this ultimately, there's always an argument in invasion ecology that, we're being, that nativity is sort of like our threshold as far as, something good versus bad. And certainly as lots of species shift, and Toni Lynn's paper on the range shifting native species is a good example of that. We're probably going to need to broaden that thinking to be more, impact or end result focused. So not that we're going to hold this barrier of native versus non-native, especially as lots of species are shifting their ranges with climate change, but instead thinking about, what are the properties of this ecosystem that we want to support or maintain, what are the positive and negative potential impacts of any given species that may come in. There's a lot of kind of paradigm shifts in the way that we need to be thinking about ecological communities.
Thanks. Okay, so the next question has to do with the ECAT assessment. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
Mm-hmm.
So it asks, for your review, you did a more specific cross-referencing of major impact species as to whether those impacts would be relevant to New England. Is that correct?
That is correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then the second part of the question is, also given the amount of work you would use, would you use ICAT again, or do you have other recommendations for assessing impacts?
So one of the things that is really time consuming about the ICAT is that it finds like every single paper about a given species. So for example, if you have a high impact species, like kudzu, for example, and you've got dozens of actually kudzu is not a good example because there are surprisingly few papers on the impacts of that species. But in my imagined world where there are lots of them, ICAT has you go through every single paper that describes any sort of impact for that species. And I think we could probably draw the line after like one or two, if we see, 3 examples where this species has had negative impacts on communities, we probably don't need to go through and find another dozen demonstrating similar things. So that's part of what's time consuming. Another piece of advice, though, that we've been working on a little bit in the Northeast is that a lot of our neighboring states have done some form of weed risk assessment already. So we have been compiling existing risk assessments, and the protocols differ between states. But generally, some information that you need is, if your neighboring state has done a risk assessment for that species, then probably some of the information that you're looking for, how fast does it spread, and, what are the management options for it, and what are the known impacts. Those are pretty typical questions across different weed risk assessments. So if you can gather that information from neighboring states and see, if that species has been evaluated, then that gives you a pretty good step in the right direction of doing your own risk assessment, because you can, use their existing analyses as a starting point.
Okay, we have another question here. It says, I might have missed this at the beginning, but what sources do you use for climate data with your models?
So the range shift listing tool was, all of that is based on spatial models that were developed in 2015, 2016, and published in 2016. So at that point, we were using the previous generation of general circulation models from the IPCC. I think it was the 5th assessment was the last one. I have a hard time keeping track of numbers. And those are all ones that have been downscaled basically to sort of a landscape relevant spatial resolution. I think in that case, it was about a 5-kilometer grid size. So we chose ones that were kind of identified as more relevant to the Northeast. And, that tends to be what what people do, they look for, a lot of climatologists have done analyses of different downscale climate models to see how well they represent past climate, with the hope that if they're doing a good job with past climate, they're hopefully doing a better job with projections of future climate. And so you can kind of hone in on a set that seem relevant to a given region. Different models do better jobs in some parts of the world or some, systems than others.
Thanks. So we're right at the top of the hour. And so in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to cut this a little bit short. I know there's many more questions in the chat box than we have time to answer.
Maggie?
Yeah.
I was just one thing I realized I wanted to share with people. It'll take 20 seconds, but
Yes,
we just put this
please.
out. And if any of you, like me, aren't necessarily doing with your day job invasive plant work, or with your weekends, you like to spend time, we did actually just produce a management challenge for your backyard, essentially, like what to replace some of those invasives in your backyard. And you can share this with your local garden center to encourage the public to replace their invasives or to buy native. And you can find this on our website as well. So it's just like a thing you can do as outreach as well.
That's awesome. I'm definitely going to check that out when we get off the call today. Well, I just want to thank Bethany and thank Toni, Lynn, and Gren and the whole team that they work with. You guys do incredible work, and I'm so glad you were able to share some of the resources and information that you have. And again, I encourage everyone to check out their website, riskmanagement.org. When I have the presentation, I'll send that around, including some of the different resources and links that were mentioned in the presentation. But thank you guys again. Any last comments before we close out for today?
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Thanks for all your time.
Excellent. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care.
Bye.